Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Romano. I'm with NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. I'm the Senior Vice President of Industry Affairs and Business Development. I'm joined today by Tom Cohen, a partner at the Kelly Dry Law Firm, who works with a number of stakeholders throughout the industry. We're delighted to join you today to talk about some of our key issues in Washington, D.C. as we approach an election, a very interesting time in Washington in terms of discussions about telecom policy, obviously, and broader issues too. But we wanted to give you some insights into what's happening specifically on the broadband infrastructure side, broadband policy issues more generally. And I'm delighted, Tom, that you could join me today. Thank you so much for hopping on with me.
You know, Mike, it's always great when you and I get together. There's never enough time to talk about what we want to talk about.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. And I enjoy our collaboration on these sorts of things. So thank you. So we're going to kick off today. We'll spend about 25, 30 minutes talking about the current lay of the land. And let's start, Tom, with the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This auction is going to be taking place in just a few days from when our discussion here is broadcast. And, we won't get into a lot of detail with the current status of it, obviously. But let's talk about sort of how we got here, the important issues that led up to where we are today. Why this auction is so important and why there seems to be such great interest in it, as the FCC recently announced just this week.
Well, the RDOF auction, the RDOF program, is the culmination sort of 10 years of work at the FCC. Look at how far we've come, in a sense, since the National Broadband Plan recommended a new direction for the high cost fund. And it's gone through a bunch of sort of iterations with, CAF phase 1, and then CAF phase 2, the cost model program, which I've got to say, you look back on it and boy, what a mistake it was. Too much money for too little. And then we got to the CAF phase 2 auction, which proved the concept of reverse auctions could give us more for less in terms of spending money. And now what we've got with the RDOF auction is continuation of that CAF phase 2 auction, but with a tweak. That is, you know what? We underestimated the speeds that people will want, the performance. 4-in-1, 10-in-1. We're all just, saying, what were we thinking then? And now we've got, the budget clearing round proposal, which should give an incentive for higher performance bids.
Yeah, Tom, you bring up a good point. It's funny you use the word iterations. I was thinking gyrations in terms of how high cost policy's gone. We've given out a lot of money to folks who pledged to do 10-1 and really did not much more than that with it, if that. And it's certainly very frustrating. You do highlight another important point too, which is this clearing round provision. This was something that was hotly debated leading up to the development of the rules, but you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, what this clearing round provision is going to do is allow those bidders who are proposing to do the best networks to prevail. And so the commission will, in a sense, and the ratepayers will be getting the best bang for the buck in terms of the amount of money they're spending. They're going to be getting the best possible networks for that, which is terrific. I think will lead to more folks having an incentive to bid for better performance in the program. One other thing I think, Tom, that's interesting too is how we got here. You look at these auctions. One of the things that they sort of look at is unserved areas, and recently, we just saw an NTCA member, Premier Communications, file for a petition for reconsideration. Very interesting point, because there's somebody who bought essentially a CAF 2 model property, and they've actually done fiber in those areas. So in a sense, they've done this great work, and now they're trying to figure out sort of what comes next. And so that's going to be another question. It's not an RDOF question, it's an after the RDOF question about what do you do in those areas where somebody has deployed fiber but still has, let's say loans to repay or stuff like that, or operating expenses. So, the RDOF is a great opportunity. I think the interest we've seen from service providers is tremendous. Obviously, it's up, I think the chairman said 75% against the CAF 2 auction in terms of people looking to participate. But But I guess this is all just to say that, interestingly, the debate won't be done. We're still going to be talking about how to solve in other unserved areas, and then what do you do to keep rates affordable and keep networks sustainable in areas where once they do get built too.
Well, Mike, I think that's a great point. I mean, what we're doing is trying to converge on better solutions and keep working towards that. And the idea, I think, is to maximize the areas where fiber goes. And we're going to see how that works in this auction. You know, in my sense, it's going to be sort of a two-tier auction. Those areas that are going to get fiber, and then everything else, more remote areas, much higher cost areas, where we're going to end up with a mixture of fixed wireless, satellite in those areas. You know, going back to your point about the areas that get fiber, yeah, we're going to see, you know, as we work towards that, is that going to be enough money or not? So that's one thing. I think a second thing is right now, you know, the old standard, as we said, was, well, first, were you getting 4-in-1 broadband? Then 10-in-1, now 25-in-3. I think the odds are we're going to go quickly to 100 meg down. In fact, we just saw in California, the governor issue an executive order with that. So we're going to go 100 meg down. What's it going to be up? 10, 20, something like that, I think is inevitably where we're going to go, which may open up other areas to be, in effect, unserved.
Right. It's now I'm going to go back to your word of iteration. It's an iterative process. And sort of you solve for 80% of the areas, then you have to come back and get the 20%, solve for a portion of those, and you keep raising the bar on what's unserved until you hopefully you get to a state where everybody is served.
Yeah, you know, these are long-term programs and, you know, 10-year programs. And so you're trying to figure out, though, you know, we have the ACAM process. Do we need to sort of ratchet that up again? Mm-hmm. Say, okay, 25-in-3, we need to get you to 100 by, again, 10, 20, sooner than later is what we're trying to do. And how do we balance that? Are there other incentives? You know, the private, what people need to understand is every year the private sector spends, you pick the number, 70, 80 billion dollars to build out some form of broadband. Government spends, I'll say, 8 billion, a tenth of that. So can we get the private sector to edge out and do more of this as well in that interim? That deals with barriers to deployment, things like that, where we can, in effect, not spend the money. And then what do we do with these other programs over that period so that we're not always saying, you know, it's a 10-year cycle. I think we need to do that. There are people I know, you know, you have in states, tax credits. Idaho is one that comes to mind. Do we want to do more of that? I know there are people who are concerned about excise taxes states levy on, you know, purchase of broadband equipment. All sorts of things that we can do without creating a whole new direct spending program.
Right. No, and I want to come back to those, but you raised an interesting point about direct spending programs. The RDOF's one we've talked about so far and focused on. It's not the only one out there. And in fact, it's interesting watching some of these things try to sometimes to drive down the highway to the same destination, but do they always necessarily stay in their lanes? How do they bump up against one another potentially if they're trying to change lanes? So the other one that's been very active recently is the USDA Reconnect program. You know, they've put out, it seems like multiple awards a day now in the last few days. It's just a steady drumbeat of awards. You know, we've looked at it and seen, and interestingly enough, thus far, at least we're not hearing any concerns about sort of crossing over of lanes. I think in part it's because the Reconnect was aimed at those areas that were lacking 10-1 primarily. So it's literally the most unserved of the unserved. In many respects, I've sort of thought of it almost as, it's like what the FCC's Remote Areas Fund was planning to do, right? And picking up those areas that no one was going to get to otherwise. But, you know, Reconnect's out there as well. And in some ways, it's a sort of precursor to the infrastructure programs that people have kept hoping to see. So your thoughts on the Reconnect program, and then I want to pivot into that question as well into your broader thoughts about what might happen with infrastructure. Congress has been talking about this, and what might be coming down the pike in terms of big infrastructure packages behind sort of the Reconnect infusions we've seen so far.
Okay, I'll get to the Reconnect, but first I want to go back to you to talk about phase 2 of RDOF.
Oh, okay. Yep.
All right, so I'll give you the turn. Why don't you
Yeah.
start on that, and then we'll go to the others, because that's looming after this.
Right. You bring up a good point. So Reconnect phase 2, for folks who aren't familiar with it, is basically the areas that that will be identified as unserved once the maps are fixed. And the FCC has, right now at least, indicated a budget of roughly $400 million a year, or 4.4 billion or so over 10 years, or 4 billion over 10 years for this part of the program. Now, the big question there is, first, where are those areas? And then second, will we be able to identify them as the time goes on? I mean, how long will that take to get those maps set? And so, and then will the money be enough to do that once we figure out where those areas are? So really interesting questions around RDOF phase 2. I think it's a wise sequencing of how to deal with it, but it is a program that's going to take some time to unfold and figure out and it's behind figuring out all the mapping issues first.
Right. I mean, it's sort of a sleeper. I mean, people haven't focused on it, but I think you're right. I mean, the first step has got to be the mapping, because these are partially unserved areas. And hopefully we'll get there, but I don't necessarily see better mapping in 2021. Maybe 2022 or something. That begins to tell you, though, when phase 2 may happen. And it may be something where, they can find even more money, though, once they get there. So it's coming. It's interesting, as we'll talk about in a moment, Congress and an infrastructure program. Are these, phase 2, the infrastructure program, going to fit together in some way? And who knows? I agree with you. The RUS's Reconnect program has been a wonderful sleeper. I got to give you guys credit on that. I mean, you got the money in the bills, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, add up. It's, been given out just through a straight grant process. And as you said, it really is going to the more remote areas. I mean, they've got to have, the locations have to be 90% unserved. So they're going out of the way, out of the, normal path, but they are largely giving the money to fiber. Yeah. In other words, they're saying, I've got to give the administrator a lot of credit. He's saying, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it right. It's sort of their attitude, like with rural electrification, right? Yeah. I'm not going to give you a generator. I'm going to give you a wired connection. And sort of the same thing here. That's what they're, going to do. Well, so it's going to be interesting just to keep adding to it.
Yeah, and you raise an interesting point. I mean, the fact is they are putting fiber in a lot of places, which are areas that are remote. I mean, they're harder to reach. There was a reason they're the most unserved areas in the country, and it is interesting to see that it does prove up the notion that you can find a way in many of these places. Sort of, again, going back to the iterative process, you can find a way in many places to do fiber if you're creative about it, if you have the right programs in place, and ultimately, to your point, get America wired in the same way we tackled some of the infrastructure challenges in the past century.
Yeah, I mean, people want that performance. They want to do it more remotely, as they're doing today with the COVID emergency. And again, you do it once, and anything you have to put in after that, like you were talking before about Premier, is a percentage of all that. It's not, mm-hmm. It's a fraction of it. It's not that much.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's turn now to the discussion of, Congress, right? I mean, we're in a position, a place that's, sitting here today, we're a few weeks away from election. There's been discussions of COVID relief packages, some and bills floated that have $40 billion, $80 billion for broadband infrastructure. Some of them aiming for higher speeds. And the joke's been made before, it's been infrastructure week, many weeks over, and this year and prior years to try to move something along. What do you see on that? What are the key issues that are driving that? What's holding up potentially that being inserted? What are some of the interesting provisions you've seen out there that folks might find of interest as they're trying to figure out how to make a business case for investment in broadband in rural areas?
Well, I think underlying all this is what now is the essential nature of broadband, right? Telework, telehealth, online learning, and I'll have to say, a preference for a wired product in doing that. And, for all we can talk about satellites, fixed wireless, even, 5G fixed wireless, it's not the same. You get that wire, and you not only get higher performance today, you will get it tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. I mean, the new, services are no longer 1 gig, they're 2 gig, 10 gig to keep going like that. And at some point, we're going to start getting, the apps people to develop things, augmented reality, virtual reality, other things that begin to really fill it up in both directions. So that's all coming, I think. So you start with it's essential. You start with a sense of we can't leave rural areas stranded. Can't leave these people stranded. It's just, almost unconscionable at this point. And so I think this is what's driving it. I think if the Democrats sweep the presidency, the Senate, the House, I think there's a good chance in the first 100 days, something like, the Pallone-Clyburn bills are going to happen.
Right, and those bills contained a pretty significant amount of money. I mean, is $80 billion, I think I recall, in one of the ones, $40 billion in others. But to your point too, those bills, interestingly, did place an increased emphasis on sort of scalable networks that are going to be capable of meeting demands upstream and downstream. And that's one of to your point about sort of the essential nature of broadband. One of the things that's been highlighted, obviously, is the essential nature of broadband, but also the essential nature of higher upload speeds, the ability to higher up, better capacity to interact in a two-way format, send and receive files in a way like never before. I mean, if somebody who's got 3 kids who are all remote learning from home, as my wife and I telework from home most days, it is a crazy amount of bandwidth that we're sending or need to send data in both directions and receive data. So I think these bills do place a greater emphasis on that too, which is good. I think this is finally shined a spotlight on how important these things are in making our society more resilient and productive, regardless of the circumstances. At the same time, as you say, I mean, obviously, politics is involved here, so we're looking at it in the middle of an election. It seems like it's unlikely that any stimulus relief is going to happen. Of course, by the time this is broadcast, who knows? Maybe they do pass something. But I think the good news, as you say, is that a lot of discussions are teed up, and there's a bipartisan consensus on the importance of broadband. I mean, it sort of joke sometimes that it's almost a bill a day seems to get introduced with somebody having a new broadband infrastructure idea, which is a good thing. Sometimes it's hard to sort through them all, but it's a good thing to have that sort of marketplace of ideas out there on how to do this best. Just hopefully they do it in a way that does promote the best possible broadband rather than looking for patch jobs and short-term solutions.
Well, and that is the question. Will they keep this incremental approach, which, so we talked about at the very beginning, if we've learned any lessons, you provide it, people will come. Apps providers will build it. And right now, with more people working or learning remotely and alike, all of a sudden table stakes has gone up quite a bit. So, I think we're getting there. The idea is to push fiber as far as possible. Quite frankly, there's been so much talk, and you and I have been part of this about, 5G. 5G, it's great, But at the end of the day, the true technology or infrastructure underlying it all is fiber, 5G and alike. And so if you get fiber out, as we're talking about, it's there for 5G, it's there for smart cities, it's other uses, and it becomes that fundamental infrastructure on which everything can be based. I think people are coming around to thinking like that and saying, yeah, I want to be tech neutral, but I'm not tech neutral with 5G. I picked something. And you should pick fiber as well.
That's absolutely true. I mean, it'd be funny. So the 5G fund is floating around right now. The FCC's getting ready to do something there. It'd be funny because the analogy to what you're doing on the fixed wired side, if you will, or the fixed side, if you did it in mobile, you would have 5G, 4G, 3G, and 2G bid, but with different weights. And of course we're not doing that, right? Because that makes no sense. Everybody wants to build 5G. So why on the fixed side would you do different things weighted based upon the thought that, well, gosh, we've got to make sure 2G can play, the equivalent of 2G can play in the fixed space. It's a very odd and interesting dynamic when you put it that way, for sure. And you're right too about the notion that people are coming around to realizing the importance of fiber in a 5G environment. Everybody wants 5G. I mean, we would love to have blazing fast wireless service. We'd love to have the IoT applications that I think are really going to be a big part of 5G, but that is going to depend upon so much backhaul, so many small cells being deployed. And even the big guys who are talking, obviously playing up their 5G ambitions significantly, it's clear that they're also increasingly talking to investors and Wall Street and others, operators, about how much this is going to sit upon a fiber foundation. So you're right, that is sort of converging, coalescing around that infrastructure notion.
Yeah, Mike, and your points are great on this. I mean, I have nothing against fixed wireless or satellite. I think there will be niches where they will end up being at some point. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the proposed 5G fund, they're talking about what, 35 megs of mobile service? I mean, it's interesting with this, now we're several weeks past it, but the iPhone 5G announcement, they include a chip that will do, I think 28 and 39 meg. That's great for throughput, but the distances in which it travels, incredibly short. You've got to have fiber tying all that up. And if you look at what T-Mobile is committed to do, the speeds are low. We're talking now about 100 meg. They're not talking, next year for wireline. They're not even in that camp. And so again, there's a sense of we need to bring this as fiber as far out as we can go so that people have these opportunities.
Yep. So we got about 5 minutes left, Tom. It is amazing how we fly through these conversations. And we haven't touched upon a few topics that I do want to touch upon. Well, one, I'm not even sure I do, but I feel like it'd be remiss in a telecom policy discussion if you don't talk about net neutrality. I mean, I think, it's something that at least we should touch upon and let folks know the status of what's happening there. Obviously, there's some action at the FCC right now on that. And then the election portends kind of a potential shift on this, a pendulum swinging, if you will, depending on which way it goes. And obviously it's something that consumed a lot of oxygen in the regulatory telecom policy space for a year, 2 years back a few years ago. So, can you at least provide an update on where that stands for our audience and letting them know kind of who's got things in play where on that right now?
I think the pendulum will swing back if the Democrats take over. I wish Congress would settle this. I think it's more a political issue than a policy issue in some ways. Yeah. And I am not, having spent a long time doing this, a big fan of behavioral regulation. And that general conduct standard that was in the Wheeler net neutrality and alike, again, going back to my point, the private sector, for whatever you think about them, they invest an incredible amount in our broadband networks, and they survived, and more than survived during the COVID emergency. They worked. And what you want is to keep that money flowing at the end of the day, not just for one wireline network, but for multiple networks, so people have choices out there. And a lot of people do have at least choice of two providers now. So to me, you know, behavioral regulation and what some call the raised finger of, you know, the regulator, don't you do that. You know, it took them over a year to get out a report on zero rating that wasn't even conclusive. The commercial marketplace, you know, my clients, the people who are the members of your association, they are constantly rejiggering what they need to do because circumstances change. Things that don't operate in a commercially reasonable manner, timely manner, just it stalls investment in what we're trying to do. So as I said, I think the pendulum will swing back, but I think there are more important things to focus on.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. You know, there's value in certainty. There's value in certain rules of the road that can be helpful in giving people, again, the lanes to stay in. But you're right. I mean, there were some parts of that 2016, 2017, or 2016, I guess, or 2015 decisions that were like the general conduct standard that were so open-ended and vague that it became hard to read what you know, to your point about behavioral regulation, it wasn't even necessarily clear sometimes what behavior was being signaled as what you should do. And that's the hardest place to be in. I mean, you know, I think both a complete vacuum of guidance and guidance that is, you know, thorough but ambiguous, neither one is terribly productive. So it will be interesting to see how the pendulum shifts and what comes out of if there is a change in administrations and in Congress as well.
And Mike, you know what? It plays to the big incumbents more than the smaller players and the new entrants, because the big guys know how to play regulation. Mm-hmm. And so I find it almost counterproductive. It's like privacy regulation and the like. I know you want it and it's important for consumers, but understand it deters new firms from getting into the business. You know, I mean, you and I have been doing this a while. It's, you know, in the old days, AT&T, when they had Ma Bell, would say to MCI, yeah, come on into the regulatory pool. Good
right.
luck.
Right.
And it's the same thing here.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So, Tom, I think we're just about up on time. You know, other topics could have run through, but you know, we stayed our half hour here. As always, thanks. I always enjoy the conversations with you. I'm sure we'll continue this in some format somewhere again. But thanks for your time here with us today, and we will send it back to the Mountain Connect conference.
You're welcome, Mike. Good to be with you.
Thanks.